NonCompete moving picture entertainment. Now with sound. A hearty hello. I am E. American Johnson, purveyor of fine cinematographic projectoscopic agitation propaganda for the electrical era. And this is part 2 in our series on the I.W.W. and the black worker based on the article by Dr. Philip Foner. And now, without further ado, our feature presentation in which timber workers in the Deep South, black and white alike, overcome racial barriers to mount one of the fiercest resistance to capitalist abuses in American history. Enjoy!
One of the most inspiring chapters of the I.W.W.'s organizing activity relates to the lumber industry of the South. The labor force of the Southern lumber industry was made up of both white and black workers. Indeed, in 1910, over half of the 262,000 workers was composed of black people. In the main, the blacks were unskilled workers in the lowest paid jobs. They did most of the heavy manual work in the sawmills, on railroads, in the turpentine camps, at skidways, and in the swamps. In 1910, of 7,958 black people in the sawmills and planing mills of Texas, 7,216 were laborers. There was not a single black sawyer. The St. Louis lumbermen, the employer's organ, justified this situation on the grounds that there is a limit to the amount of wages that can be paid with safety to colored laborers around sawmills and wood camps. Too much pay causes discontent and idleness among them. To the black lumber workers, notes a student of the Mississippi lumber industry, emancipation from slavery had not brought the fruits of freedom. He simply had exchanged his lot for a different system of economic bondage. Having stolen the magnificent forests of Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, East Texas, and South Georgia from the public domain, the lumber companies proceeded to operate them as feudal domains, filling the towns with gunmen whom the authorities commissioned as deputy sheriffs and jailing anyone who questioned their rule. The jails also provided the companies with a cheap supply of labor. Men were seized on the railroads for beating their way and sentenced to 90 days in jail. Then these unfortunate workers were forced to toil for the period of their sentence in the turpentine camps. Black and white laborers were frequently arrested, fined, and imprisoned for no offense at all, or simply for being out of a job and forced to work out their sentence in the lumber camps. Often, an employer would arrange to pay the fine on condition that the debt was worked out. In 1904, the Supreme Court upheld laws enacted at the close of the century eliminating peonage, but in the isolated camps in the southern woods, these laws and the Supreme Court decision cut little ice. To be sure, individuals found guilty of establishing peonage could be prosecuted and convicted, but few workers in southern lumbering, particularly black workers, dared to protest to the authorities, knowing that the company-dominated local courts would never convict the guilty parties. The timber and lumber workers read a complaint in 1912. In many places are being practically held as peons with barbed wire enclosures where there is no law except the will of the lumber trust's imported thugs and gunmen. For wages as low as $1.25 a day, or average weekly wages of from $7 to $9, men were forced to labor 10 to 12 hours a day. With few exceptions, wages were paid monthly and usually either entirely or in large part in scrip or time checks. Scrip was simply some substitute for legal money, paper, chits, cardboard, coin, metal tags, etc., which ordinarily bore the name of the issuing company, a valuation, and the statement good for merchandise only. If spent in the company store, it passed at face value, but it could be converted to cash only at a customary discount of 5 to 30%. Since prices in the company stores ranged from 1/3 to 50% above prices in surrounding communities, the face value of the wages used for merchandise was always considerably reduced. The time check bore the condition that it was to be cashed at some future specified date. If the bearer, for whatever reason, cashed it prior to the specified date, he was generally forced to take a discount of 5 to 10%. Some workers, to obtain legal currency, were forced to borrow from the employer at usurious rates of interest. In other words, these workers were actually paying interest on their wages being withheld from them. The great majority of lumber workers lived and died in communities owned and operated by the mill companies. They were charged outrageous rents for primitive huts heated with open fires. They were forced to pay a compulsory medical insurance fee, usually $1 to $1.50 a month, for doctors in whose selection they had no voice and who knew little or nothing of medicine. They were forced to pay from 75 cents to $1 per month for accident insurance, which was bought by the lumber company at from 50 to 60 cents per man. The comprehensive study of conditions in the lumber industry in Louisiana by the State Bureau of Statistics of Labor pointed out, we found every labor law on the statutes being violated. Following a similar study in Texas, the Commission on Industrial Relations found that in such communities, political liberty does not exist and its forms are hollow mockery. Free speech, free assembly, and a free press may be denied, as they have been denied time and again, and the employer's agent may be placed in public office to do his bidding. Since the American Federation of Labor showed no interest in organizing the oppressed workers of the southern lumber industry, they were required to unionize by themselves. On December 3, 1910, Arthur L. Emerson and J. Smith and a group of lumber workers in the DeRidder area of Louisiana, most of them sympathetic to the I.W.W. and to the Socialist Party, set up a local union. Emerson, Smith, and a few others who were wobblies then traveled in the guise of book agents, insurance solicitors, evangelists, even card sharps to avoid company gunmen, going from camp to camp, mill to mill, bringing the message of unionism to the lumber workers. By June 1911, enough locals had been organized to set up the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, or BFTW as it was popularly known, as a national union with Emerson as president and Smith as general secretary. Since black workers comprised so large a portion of the labor force, the leaders of the Brotherhood knew that no union could be effective in the Yellow Pine region unless it opened its doors to black workers as well as whites. The constitution of the organization allowed black people to join, but the Southern tradition of segregation was retained by providing for colored lodges, which were forbidden to retain their initiation fees and dues, but were required to deliver all such funds for safekeeping to the nearest white local. The BFTW spread rapidly over Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, recruiting black and white lumberjacks, mill workers, tenant and small farmers who worked in the lumber industry for parts of the year, and town craftsmen. But the employers quickly struck back. During the summer and fall of 1911, between 5,000 and 7,000 of the most active members of the Brotherhood, white and black, were blacklisted. At the same time, the companies shut down their plants and announced that they would not reopen them until the Brotherhood had gone out of existence. But though the lumber workers suffered severe privation, neither the lockout nor the blacklisting destroyed the union. The Southern Lumber Operators Association then decided to reopen the plants, invite black members of the Brotherhood to go back to work at higher wages, and recruit black scabs from all parts of Louisiana and Texas to keep the mills operating. Neither of these two plans succeeded. No black members of the Brotherhood went back to work, and few black scabs were recruited. When the mills reopened in the winter of 1912, the lockout was officially ended by February. It was not with scab labor. By May 1912, the Brotherhood had a membership of between 20,000 to 25,000 workers, about half of whom were black. The experience in the battle against the lockout, the refusal of the black members to desert the Union, and of blacks to scab, had imbued the Brotherhood with a clearer understanding of what it called the Black Question. In an appeal to timber and lumber workers, the Union declared, as far as the Black Question goes, it means simply this: either the whites organize with blacks, or the bosses will organize the blacks against the whites, in which last case it is hardly up to the white to damn the black people. Southern workers ought to realize that while there are two colors among the workers in the South, there is actually only one class. It is the object of this organization to teach that the only hope of the workers is through industrial organization, that while the colors in question are two, the class in question is only one. The first thing for a real working man to do is to learn by a little study that he belongs to the working class, line up with the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, the industrial workers of the world, and make a start for industrial freedom. Up to this point, the Brotherhood, though friendly to the Wobblies, had not affiliated to the I.W.W. But with the American Federation of Labor still showing no interest in a movement of which black people were a substantial number, the Brotherhood turned to the I.W.W. for assistance and proposed affiliation. When the proposed affiliation was agreed to by the leaders of the BFTW and the I.W.W., the latter organization sent Bill Haywood and Covington Hall, editor of the Voice of the People, to the Brotherhood's convention at Alexandria, Louisiana, May of 1912, to present the case for affiliation to the delegates. Arriving at the convention, Haywood expressed surprise that no black workers were present. He was informed that the black workers were meeting separately in another hall because it was against the law in Louisiana for white and black workers to meet together. Haywood brushed this explanation aside, declaring, "You work in the same mills together. Sometimes a black man and a white man chop down the same tree together. You are meeting in convention now to discuss the conditions under which you labor. This can't be done intelligently by passing resolutions here and then sending them out to another room for the black man to act upon. Why not be sensible about this and call the black workers into this convention? If it is against the law, this is one time when the law should be broken." Haywood was followed by Covington Hall, who told the delegates that he was not only a Southerner, born and raised, but also past Adjutant General, National Secretary of the United Sons of Confederate Veterans, and that he supported Haywood's suggestion completely. "Let the black workers come together with us, and if any arrests are made, all of us will go to jail, white and colored together." The advice was followed, and the blacks were called into the session. The mixed gathering adopted the proposal of affiliation with the I.W.W. and elected black and white delegates to the September convention of the I.W.W. in Chicago, where the merger was to be formally effected. Haywood and Covington also addressed a mass meeting at the Alexandria Opera House under the Brotherhood's sponsorship. Here, too, there was no segregation, and for the first time in the city's history, black and white sat together in all parts of the hall at a public meeting. Not even the Socialist Party in Louisiana allowed blacks and whites to meet together. There was no interference by the management or the police, Haywood reported, and the meeting had a tremendous effect on the workers who discovered that they could mingle in meetings as they mingled at work. The industrial worker carried the news from Alexandria under the heading Miracle of the New South. In July, the convention's vote to affiliate with the I.W.W. was overwhelmingly confirmed by the Brotherhood's rank-and-file membership in a general referendum. At the September convention of the I.W.W., with black and white delegates from the South present, the merger was consummated and the Brotherhood of Timber Workers became the Southern District of the National Industrial Union of Forest and Lumber Workers. Space does not permit a full account of the moving history of the Southern lumber workers after the decision to affiliate with the I.W.W. Suffice it to say that it is a history filled with intensive efforts of the feudal-minded lumber barons to destroy the unity of black and white workers and smash the Union. In this drive, they resorted to every weapon in the arsenal of anti-unionism: blacklisting of union members, arrests and trial of the president and 64 leading members black and white, eviction of union members from company houses, and spreading the charge throughout the South that the Union was a revolutionary organization which sought to carry out the I.W.W.'s policy of equality for black and white, which, if not checked, would undermine the entire fabric of Southern society. Yet none of these measures succeeded. The men brought to trial were acquitted after having been held in jail for 4 months. On November 11, 1913, 9 days after the close of the trial in Grabau, Louisiana, 1,300 Union men, white, Native American, and black, went on strike at the American Lumber Company in Maryville, Louisiana. This was to be the biggest strike in the Brotherhood's history. Soon after the strike began, the company erected enclosures about the workers' shacks and the mills and began shipping in non-union crews, especially black workers from other parts of Louisiana and Texas, men who knew nothing of what had taken place in the mill. The black quarters were surrounded with a high barbed wire fence which was charged with electricity to keep the strikers from talking to the scabs. But the strikers did get to them nevertheless. The railroad track was lined with pickets 4 miles on each side of the town, and as the trains carrying the scabs slowed down to enter Maryville, leaflets were thrown through the windows or onto the platforms, pointing out that a strike was taking place and appealing to you colored wage workers of Louisiana and Texas to do your duty by the lumberjacks of Maryville, white, Native American, and black. The appeal brought results. Many black workers refused to enter the mill, and quite a few joined the strikers, living with the families of black workers. Foreign-born workers and Mexicans who were brought in as scabs also showed their solidarity with the strikers. As the Union pointed out in a statement that was widely published, "It is a glorious thing to see, the miracle that has happened here in Dixie. This is coming true of the impossible. The union of workers regardless of color, creed, or nationality. To hear the Americans saying, 'You can starve us, but you cannot whip us.' The black workers saying, 'You can fence us in, but you cannot make us scab.' The Mexicans shouting vivas for the Union. Never did the Southern Lumber Operators Association and the American Lumber Company expect to see such complete and defiant solidarity." The unity of black and white workers during the strike was so firm that one of the I.W.W. organizers in the area cited it as a lesson for the entire working class, which may feel proud of the solidarity displayed by these fighting timbermen and their wives and daughters. "For be it known that the many colored men belonging to the Union are standing pat with their white fellow slaves, and also be it known that the writer has known for years that all the colored workers needed was for the white workers to meet them halfway, and they will always respond eager and anxious to fight to better their conditions." He pointed out that black strikers were arrested and jailed on the charge of unlawfully meeting in the same hall with white men, but they laughingly lined up and marched to jail, singing the rebel songs they had learned at the daily mass meetings in the Union Hall, and despite threats, after their release, they appeared in greater numbers the next day to hear speakers and sing more songs to fan the flames of discontent. When one worker told a meeting that even though he had 9 children, he was willing to strike if the Union can guarantee food for my children, the following dramatic episode occurred. When he made his plea for his family, every farmer in the audience rose and confirmed the pledge of the one black present, who said, "We farmers and workers will have to stick together in the Union and win this fight, or all of us, white and colored, are going back to slavery. I have so many pigs in my pen, so many heads of cattle in the woods, so many chickens in the yard, and so many bushels of corn and sweet potatoes, and so many gallons of syrup in my barn, and I pledge myself that so long as I have a pound of meat or a peck of corn, no man, white or colored, who goes out in this strike will starve, nor will his children, and I believe all the white farmers here are ready to pledge the same." "They did to a man," quotes Covington Hall in his account of the incident.
I say, is this not rousing entertainment? Are you not enthused and aroused by this elucidating disquisition? Then why not consider supporting our channel on Patreon or Camaraderie? No money? No problem. You can also support the channel with the merest activity, by which of course I refer to liking, commenting, and subscribing, as well as sharing our fine quality content with whatever riffraff you happen to carouse with. And now, back to the show!
Failing to break the strike, the company recruited a gang of thugs and criminals and had them sworn in as deputy sheriffs. The deputies proceeded to move about the town, molesting black strikers and ransacking their homes. On January 9th, Robert Allen, a black striker who had been one of the most faithful pickets, was arrested at a union meeting and taken away to jail. No warrant was served, nor was any reason given for the arrest. The same evening, Allen was placed in an automobile and deported from Maryville, leaving behind his wife and 5 children. The arrests and deportations reached a climax in mid-February when deputy sheriffs, mobs of businessmen, and company officials destroyed the union headquarters and deported all union members from Maryville under penalty of death if they returned. Anyone found with a union leaflet or circular on him was arrested and deported. The town of Maryville now was completely in the hands of the mob as company gunmen, many deputized as sheriffs, armed with rifles, marched through the streets, seizing black and white union members and shipping them out of town. The union tried to get Governor Hall to do something to halt the reign of terror, pointing out that under the Civil Rights Bill, the town was liable for expulsion of even strangers without due process of law. But the governor, charging that the union, by allowing black workers to meet together with whites in the same union halls, was seeking to destroy the Southern way of life, refused to act. The 4-day wave of mob violence broke the back of the strikes. Most of the black and white workers were refused reemployment and blacklisted throughout the entire Southern lumber industry. Everywhere in the South, the union met with the same experience. Mob violence, attacks by gunmen, arrests and deportation of union members, appeals to governors, even to the President of the United States for interference in the illegal company persecution brought only silence. By the spring of 1914, the Brotherhood of Timber Workers had been effectively destroyed. Yet it left behind a noble tradition of militant struggle and labor solidarity, uniting black and white workers as never before in a Southern industry. Clearly, Selig Perlman and Philip Taft were incorrect when they wrote in 1935 that the I.W.W. was acutely aware of the danger of raising or even appearing to raise the issue of race equality in a Southern community, where even the workers for whom it was leading its fight might have been completely alienated by that issue. The I.W.W. did raise the issue of race equality in the lumber communities of the South, but it was the lumber companies and their allies, not the workers, who were completely alienated by that issue. Beginning in 1916, the I.W.W. launched determined campaigns to organize a number of industries and achieved a large measure of success in the western lumber areas and among the agricultural workers of the Middle and Far West. From 1917 to 1918, it initiated an organizing drive to recruit members in the factories and mills of the East. This drive took place at a time when the great migration of black workers from the South to the North was fully underway, and the I.W.W. looked forward to prospects of bringing large numbers of black workers newly entered into the Northern industry into its ranks. The I.W.W.'s plans for recruiting black workers received a great impetus when it obtained the endorsement of The Messenger, a black radical pro-socialist monthly published by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen in New York City. Strongly critical of the AFL for its discriminatory policies and refusal to take a stand against affiliated unions which barred black workers as members, The Messenger came out strongly in support of the I.W.W. And in its issue of August 1919, it declared, "The industrial workers of the world, commonly termed the I.W.W., draws no race, creed, color, or sex lines in their organization. They are making a desperate effort to get the colored men into the one big union. The black workers are at least giving them an ear, and the prospect points to their soon giving them a hand." With the Industrial Workers Organization already numbering 800,000, to augment it with 1.5 million or 2 million black workers would make it fairly rival the American Federation of Labor. This may still be done anyhow, and the reactionaries of this country, together with Samuel Gompers, the reactionary president of the American Federation of Labor, desire to hold back this trend of black labor radicalism. To hold back this trend, the alliance of big business, government, and conservative labor officials set out to take advantage of wartime hysteria to overwhelm and destroy the I.W.W. Denouncing the Wobblies as traitors, state legislatures passed criminal syndicate laws which, together with the Federal Espionage Act, were to be used to round up and imprison most of the I.W.W.'s active leaders, hundreds of organizers, and rank-and-file members. In 1918 and 1919, the United States government brought 184 members of the I.W.W. to trial on charges of interfering with the war effort and encouraging resistance to the Selective Service Act. The real crime was that they were actively engaged in organizing the most exploited sections of the American working class, including black workers, those who were traditionally neglected by nearly all unions affiliated with the American Federation of Labor. Among the I.W.W. leaders brought to trial was Ben Fletcher, black leader of the Philadelphia branch of the Marine Transport Workers, an organization hated by employers for its effectiveness in nullifying the traditional practice of playing black and white workers against each other to the benefit of the companies. The defendants were tried in 3 separate groups in Chicago, Sacramento, and Wichita. In Chicago, 101 were convicted and 12 were released during the course of the trial. 46 accused were convicted in Sacramento and 26 in Wichita. Many of the convicted received sentences of up to 20 years in prison. Fletcher was tried in Chicago, sentenced to 10 years in federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, and fined $30,000. Condemning the trial of the I.W.W. leaders as a deliberate effort to stem the drive to organize the unorganized, especially black workers, the Messenger launched a campaign to bring about Ben Fletcher's release from prison. Though critical of the I.W.W.'s syndicalist position, W.E.B. Du Bois supported the Messenger's campaign for Ben Fletcher. "We respect the industrial workers of the world," Du Bois wrote in The Crisis of June 1919, "as one of the social and political movements in modern times that draws no color line." In August 1919, A. Philip Randolph wrote in his militant journal, "Black newspapers seldom publish anything about men who are useful to the race. Some parasite ecclesiastical poltroon, sacerdotal tax gatherer, political faker, or business exploiter will have his name in the papers weekly or daily. But when it comes to one of those who fights for the great masses to lessen their hours of work, to increase their wages, to decrease their high cost of living, to make life more livable for the toiling black workers, that man is not respectable for the average black sheet. Such a man is Ben Fletcher. He is one of the leading organizers of the industrial workers of the world, commonly known as the I.W.W. He is in Leavenworth Penitentiary, Kansas, where he was sent for trying to secure better working conditions for colored men and women in the United States. He has a vision far beyond that of almost any black leader whom we know. He threw in his lot with his fellow white workers who work side by side with black men and black women to raise their standard of living. Ben Fletcher is in Leavenworth for principles, a principle which, when adopted, will put all black leaders out of their parasitical jobs. That principle is that to the workers belong the world, but useful work is not done by black leaders. We want to advocate and urge that black societies, lodges, churches, NAACP branches, and of course their labor organizations begin to protest against the imprisonment of Ben Fletcher and to demand his release. He has been of more service to the masses of the plain black people than all the windjamming black leaders in the United States. At first, the response to this appeal was not encouraging. This was the period of the Great Red Scare and the Palmer Raids, and few black organizations were willing to speak up for a militant black labor leader convicted of conspiracy and violating the Espionage Act. But slowly, the defense campaign for Fletcher mounted, and petitions and letters from black and white Americans urged President Harding to pardon the black wobbly leader and release him from the federal penitentiary. In December 1921, the Department of Justice, in a report on all wartime offenders confined in federal or state penitentiaries, advised the Attorney General against recommending executive clemency for Ben Fletcher. The reason is stated quite bluntly. He was a black who had great influence with colored stevedores, dock workers, firemen, and sailors, and material assisted in the building up of the Marine Transport Workers Union, which at the time of the indictment had become so strong that it practically controlled all shipping on the Atlantic coast. Ben Fletcher's sentence was commuted in 1923 by President Harding, and he was released from prison. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt granted him a full pardon. After his release, Fletcher remained in the I.W.W. and continued to speak and write on industrial unionism and the need for labor solidarity. No genuine attempt by organized labor, he wrote prophetically in July 1923, to wrest any worthwhile and lasting concessions from the employing class can succeed as long as organized labor, for the most part, is indifferent and in opposition to the fate of black labor. Fletcher was reportedly delivering a street corner speech for the Wobblies as late as August 1931. By that time, the I.W.W. had long been only a shell of an organization. Wartime repression had all but destroyed the Wobblies, and what was left when the war was over was further weakened by a split in the ranks over attitudes towards the Soviet Union and the Communist International, with one group supporting the first socialist state and another refusing its support because it was not based on the principles of syndicalism which the I.W.W. favored. Today, the I.W.W. still maintains headquarters in Chicago and occasionally issues the Industrial Worker, but essentially it has long ceased to exist. At no time in its history did the I.W.W. achieve a membership rivaling that of the American Federation of Labor, and it never succeeded in recruiting the great mass of black workers, even though it would have welcomed them into its ranks. When it was at the height of its influence and power, the vast majority of black workers lived in the South, were mainly tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and resided in communities where even the attempt to unionize, as the Elaine, Arkansas massacres of 1919 revealed, would have brought wholesale arrests, imprisonments, and lynchings. By the time black workers began entering northern industries in considerable numbers, the I.W.W. was in the process of being destroyed by the government's savage repression. Yet despite its rapid demise after its rapid rise, despite the fact that it never succeeded in retaining most of the members it organized, the I.W.W. wrote some of the most important chapters in the history of the American labor movement. To many, the letters I.W.W. still conjure up the picture of a sinister internal enemy of American society, an organization of bomb-throwing hobos who preached and practiced violence for no reason but to make trouble. The truth is, however, that the IWW made valuable contributions in the campaigns to organize the unorganized, particularly the unskilled, the foreign-born, women, and black workers, spearheaded the fight for free speech, and pioneered the battle for industrial unionism. It united black and white workers as never before in our history and consistently maintained a tradition of solidarity and equality in the labor movement regardless of race or color that is yet to be equaled by most labor organizations today. The spirit of the Wobblies, fortunately, is not entirely dead. It was present last spring and summer in Charleston, South Carolina, when the Union's Civil Rights Coalition conducted the successful 4-month strike of black hospital workers, and which ever since has been moving toward higher pay and union recognition for black hospital employees in other cities north and south. Union power plus soul power equals victory is the rallying cry. The Wobblies were never much for religion, but they called Jesus fellow worker Christ, and they welcomed clergymen who came to their support in their free speech fights and organizing campaigns. They would have appreciated the role that Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Reverend Ralph Abernathy and Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., played together with local 1199 drug and hospital workers of New York in organizing the black hospital workers in Charleston.
Those words were written in 1970.
Okay, I'm going to drop the old-timey accent, even though a lot of you... Oh, shit, my sleeve garter. Even though a lot of you seem to like the old-timey thing, I'll drop the gimmick for now. But those words were written in 1970, over 50 years ago. Back in the 60s, the Wobblies had been experiencing a minor but noteworthy rejuvenation in the context of the radical politics of the 1960s, with a few radical workplaces and cooperatives organizing under the banner of the I.W.W., though the organization remained a mere shadow of its former self. See, by the 1920s, the Wobblies had become in many ways victims of their own success. They challenged the power structures of capitalism and white supremacism so much that state and capitalist interests came together to severely crack down on industrial unionism, especially when members of the I.W.W. began building a peace movement and speaking out against World War I. That was crossing a line in the eyes of the capitalists. Dozens of leaders were imprisoned, and the organization was nearly eradicated by censorship and harsh suppression from the late teens and into the early 20s. Of course, it's anybody's guess if they were really upset about the World War I rhetoric or if they were nervous that black and white workers were starting to work together. Probably a combination of the two. At any rate, this gave trade union organizations like the AFL a clear passage to dominate unionism in the USA, effectively de-radicalizing most American workplaces and sapping all the momentum from the industrial unionist movement. And so the I.W.W. remained a relatively obscure niche organization for the remainder of the 20th century, especially through the Red Scare of the 1950s, when the I.W.W. was listed as a communist organization and very nearly eradicated altogether. So the resurgence in the 1960s was seen as a pretty, surprising and amazing thing, even though it was fairly limited in scope. So it's easy to see why Dr. Foner described the I.W.W. as essentially ceasing to exist by 1970, especially compared to its glory days. But fortunately, the tide has turned. Today, I'm happy to report that the I.W.W. has been growing rapidly, especially since the outbreak of COVID-19 has stoked the fires of class consciousness and spurred interest in workplace organizing. The contradictions of capitalism are piling up, people are sick of it, and that's a great thing for the I.W.W. There is a long way to go before we Wobblies regain our former glory. That's right, I am a card-carrying member myself, and if you want to help, then please consider joining at IWW.org. Anybody can join, even if you're already a member of another union or even if you're unemployed. In fact, they'll even waive or reduce fees if you're facing hardship. And if you do join, please go through the training that they offer and connect with local members in your area. And if there are not local members in your area, consider starting a chapter and finding folks in your area who want to unionize with you. And one last note for me personally, I think there's a lot we can learn from the victories and losses of the I.W.W. in today's context. It's worth reiterating that white liberal historians and academics were trying to erase the successes of the I.W.W. as early as the 1930s to argue in favor of class reductionism and white chauvinist labor organizing. And to this day, class reductionists and white chauvinists who call themselves leftists try to convince us that we should ignore issues like racism, transphobia, and ableism, even though these forms of oppression all reinforce and are reinforced explicitly by capitalism. The capitalists want to sow division between workers. We have to find ways to undo that division. The Wobblies of the 1910s were by no means perfect. I personally think that they were a little too dogmatic in claiming that industrial unionism was the only path forward for black workers, when black workers had immediate concerns that could have been addressed through more diversity in tactics. But If nothing else, the Wobblies did prove that workers can unite and struggle in economic solidarity while simultaneously directly addressing racism and other forms of oppression. My partner Luna wrote an article that touches on the subject of intersections between class, race, and other forms of oppression. I'll put a link to that in the description. And I also have a couple of videos on white chauvinism and class reductionism, which I'll link to as well. I hope you'll check them out and enjoy them. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you for watching, and now to play us out, here's an old-timey wobbly advertisement repurposed for our own demands.
Saith the voice. If you like the looks, attitude, and tone of us, NonCompete, and you are not already a subscriber, we invite you to send in $24 for 52 weeks of membership from us on Patreon or Camaraderie, or $2 for 4 weeks worth, for which we promise you your money's worth. Send in your sub today. We need the money. Subscribe to NonCompete. Wanted immediately, 100 locals and rebels to put up $1 each on NonCompete Maintenance Fund. Hop to it forthwith, by Jove, and make haste to subscribe. Toodaloo! Thanks, Will.